Welcome everyone to our another episode of our AIM Learn Fast webinars. This is the latest in a long line of webinars that we've started way back when the pandemic hit, and it's become very valuable and very great fun to do, and tons of information being passed around in all directions. I've learned a ton from doing these as well. So I've welcome back to our next one. This is the third of a kind of a mini series that we've done on some fundamentals of data analysis. And if you haven't seen the other two, they were very well received. Where we ended up chatting about number one, GPS versus wheel speeds. We'll link it into the chat box and have that placed into the chat. GPS and wheel speeds. And the other one was accelerometers, where we bring in and we just talk about the sensors themselves with examples of what those sensors can do for you. Today is temps and pressures, and we're going to do the same thing here today. And for those of you that are here, we've got the chat box. People are throwing things in there. Always fun to watch. For those of you that are watching later on YouTube and not watching it live, everything that we talk about that's in the chat box, whether it be links or anything like that, will be down in the YouTube description. So if we talk about it, if I mention that there's a link in there, I ask the link to go up in there. Like right now, we just got the link for the GPS versus wheel speed previous webinar. All of those links will be in the YouTube description for you, so keep that in mind. The next thing I'd like to do is get started on this one. The temps and pressures. It's the third one where we've been chatting about doing different things, and what I wanted to talk about was pretty fundamental sensors, right? Where most of us have those, right off the bat. Almost every data system will have that. Certainly, any ECU connection coming in will have the water temperatures and oil pressures and stuff from the ECU. And if it's not, it's typically the first thing you would add. Water temperature and oil pressure, key sensors for monitoring your engine information. So would typically be there and all good, but so what I want to do is talk a little bit at a little bit deeper level, give a little bit more information about them, and then give some examples of what I think is the most valuable way that I have learned a lot about data analysis, which is in your mind being ready to chat about and think about, boy, if I only knew a little bit more about this, I could solve a problem, get faster, solve problems that are happening with engine problems or whatever it happens to be, and then turn that around immediately and go, okay, what sensor can I add and how can I use it to really help the program, help for speed, help for longevity? And we've got 8 or 10 examples that we're going to talk about today that they're going to talk about using some of these pretty basic sensors, but in maybe different ways than what you thought, and hopefully opens up your mind and to have you be thinking about, okay, well, I've got that data, and if I add maybe a little bit more or think about it in a different way or review it in a different way inside of analysis, there's really added value to having these pretty basic sensors. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So the first thing I'd like to do is pretty basic, but there's a lot of sensors that are available. What I've done here is I've just grabbed a screen capture from the AIM website that talks about the different temperature sensors that are available. A lot of people don't jump into maybe the website this deep, but so it's kind of a double area here that I want to talk about. Number one, show you that there's a lot of different temperature sensors that are available just from AIM, let alone from other areas. But to make sure that you understand that's what's available out on the website. In this particular case, you see that the sensors are lined up over here on the left edge, and then you've got the basic category they may work in or be kind of designed for, whether it be cars or motorcycles or karting. That doesn't mean that's all it can be used for, obviously, but then a little bit of a basic description, the part number, an image that you can click on and open up and get a better picture of exactly what the sensor is going to look like if you choose to get it. And then what I really like is this: the data sheets are linked right here for you. And then if you and then how to configure it in Race Studio 3, what we mostly talk about here, and then even some Race Studio 2 configuration information. So all of this is available right on the website. If you go there, I've included a link down below to take you directly there if you haven't been there, and to make it maybe a little bit easier. So, and by the way, the presentation has been linked in the chat box, PDF of this presentation material, and you can have it down in the description below, and the link works inside of the presentation materials PDF. So this is the different aim temperature sensors. We'll talk more about these in more detail in a minute, but the next one I wanted to show was the pressure sensors. Same basic type of screen layout. All the different sensors that are available. This isn't every one that's available, but it's a pretty good idea, and all the different thread pitches and different ways to connect the sensor, and of course all the data sheets about them, and a lot of valuable information in there if you want to just start clicking on some of those. They're just PDF documents that open up for you, and you can print them out or take a look at them, or even save them onto your own computer and have them available for you if it's a sensor that you use. So there's your different aim pressures and temperature sensors. Kind of an interesting list of a very quick way of getting in there and figuring out what you want. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about what is different about the different sensors and the different pressure sensors and temperature sensors. What is available for you? What are some of the stuff that you should be thinking about as you if you're going to add one and you want to kind of start thinking about which one you want to get. Let's start with the different temperature sensors. There's three different kinds. There are a few more, but these are by far the most popular. And there's the PT100 thermal resistor sensors that are the most popular. They come with every every system that we sell. Typically, it's this one with a black cable. This one down here below. Typically, PT100s will have that. The kind of the thing about those is that they are there's a temperature range that you should be considering using them in, and here in the States, in the Fahrenheit world, 32 to 302 degrees is the safe range to use those sensors, 0 to 150 C, and so which is great for fluids and even air temperatures and some other things, right? Very much the bulk of what you're going to try to get temperatures on fit into that world, and it's the best one for that. If you want to get something of a much higher temperature range, the what you'd want to do is a thermocouple. And thermocouples we've used those a lot in the past, which was a ton of exhaust gas temperatures and things that where you're really reading something of a much higher temperature. You need to have a thermocouple. So the thermocouples are good from 0 to 1,000 degrees C, 32 to 1832 or so on the F side. The very very popular sensor in karting and others where we do a lot of exhaust gas temperature type measurements. So those are available for you as well. And then of course infrared. Back in the day, those that was they were out there, but they were pretty darn expensive, right? So the nowadays infrared sensors are something that the price has come down on a lot, and so they're much more easy to purchase and install. And people think of infrared temperature sensors as really a tire surface, maybe what most people think of it as, but in several different worlds, and even in the road racing side, I've got a few folks that have called me and wanted to get maybe a shock surface temperature and the body of the shock, and they take one of the tire temperature sensors and they turn it up and point it at the right in the middle of the shock body, and that gives them a shock body temperature sensor, so they can kind of understand how quickly the shocks get up to temperature. So it's pretty you can point those at a lot of different things, right? So keep that in mind, and don't have any really good examples of that later, but that gives you an idea. On the pressure sensor side, the one of the things that the biggest there's two things that people that I get a lot of questions on, and number one is they'll buy a sensor and they don't understand exactly what they ordered. Most of our sensors are what we call gauge, and when you plug it all in and you configure it, and when you turn it on, it reads zero, right? You know, ambient is zero, zero at rest. And but we do have sensors that if you pick the wrong one, if I jump back up to the sensor one here, you can see there's some gauges here that call out absolute, and there's another one down here. And if you pick absolute, the pressure of that sensor includes the pressure of the atmosphere. So at rest, it's approximately 1 bar or 14.7 psi right out of the box. And if somebody puts that on and is looking for a fuel pressure, and every time they shut off the car, it says that there's 14.7 psi, there's that's something that you have to understand. There are really good reasons to use absolute, and there's really good reasons to use gauge, but I just want everybody to understand that is thinking about adding a pressure sensor, to make sure you get the one that you're after. There are ways we can do custom sensors and take that out if we need to, without having to replace the sensor, but it is nice to buy the correct one the first time. The other thing that's the second one of these that's important is there is a ton of different ways that you can mount that. The um, there's a 10 millimeter M10. There's a 3/8 24 AN tight fitting, and there's an 1/8 NPTs. Same thing with the thread pitch for some of the different temperature sensors. So that's another piece that you need to understand what you're going to put it into, and that we have all these different thread pitches available for you to make it easier to install it. And then and we're going to talk about one more thing here in just a moment, that we're going to talk about making sure you get the right resolution. That's the other area that I see a lot of problems. I see people buying um, a 0 to 2000 psi, what we would call a brake pressure sensor, and then use it in an oil pressure situation where they want to see accurate information at the 80 psi range, and yet it's in a very small window of the sensor. So we're going to talk about sensor resolution here in just a moment. And of course, all of these are available. Everyone that we just showed you from this previous list, all of these are available in Race Studio 3 to very easily configure. But if you have a sensor that you're grabbing from somewhere else, a GM sensor, or a sensor that you have found that will work for you, that you want to install, it may not be in our pull down list of sensors that are available to you in our AIM library. We always have the custom sensor function, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the custom sensors, let's just jump right into that. Let's talk a little bit about the sensor and this. We need this information on the sensor, because every sensor, all it's really doing is it's taking information, this pressure or this temperature or whatever it happens to be, and it converts it to electrical values. In the end, your data logger needs to know 0 to 5 volts, and then inside of Ray Studio 3, we convert that right back to the physical unit that you're after, right? So all of this information needs to be stored, so the hardware and the software can do its thing, and to get to what you care about, which is your oil pressure is 0 to 100 psi, and you need to know where it is every 20 samples per second, right? So we have a very extensive list of these pre-programmed sensors that are available to you, but maybe you're using that sensor, as I just mentioned, that's not available. It happens, right? So the custom sensor function, very powerful, very easy. We've got some webinars in the past that talk about it. We have a new tech tips from Brick that just recently created one to talk about the fuel level custom sensor, and he walks through the process of that, and I'm sure the guys can link that recent tech tip that Brick did on that. Gives you an idea of how to use the custom sensor function at a deeper level, and it's a fairly fresh video. You do need some information for that. You need to, when you get the sensor off, and there will be a little paper in there, or a link to go grab the information, and you need to know on that sensor how many millivolts equals this pressure. Talking about pressure sensors, and it's either going to be linear or it's going to be non-linear with a lot of data points, or it's going to just tell you at 500 millivolts it's 0, and at 4500 millivolts it is 150 psi. And then you will use the custom sensor function that looks just like this, because this is one. I just created one just a couple days ago. It's a General Motors air temperature sensor that some folks needed, wanted to do some air temperature under hood temperature things and behind the radiator, ahead of the radiator kind of thing. And this, you need to know what these values are. All of the sensor makers will provide you with this if you find it. And millivolts equals how many temperatures in this case in Fahrenheit. And then we got all these data points. And then this is where, when it sees a certain millivolt, it just comes up and says, okay, well, here is that temperature. And that's what's happening behind the scenes inside of Race Studio 2. So this is fairly straightforward to do. You just got to give it all the normal information. Is it a temperature sensor? Do you want to calibrate it or not later? And then fill in the table, and then save it, and then you end up with a sensor in the list that's a custom sensor, and you select it, and you're off and running with your data logger. So custom sensor is very powerful, very easy to use inside of the Race Studio 3 software. Very, very well done by the programmers to make this easy to use. So keep that in mind if you have a sensor that you need to use. The other thing that I briefly mentioned just a little bit ago, the selecting the correct sensor resolution. The temperature sensor is not as much of a problem, but on pressure sensors especially, as I mentioned, I'm seeing this where I see somebody that is selected a brake pressure, a sensor that is designed for brake pressure, and they're trying to use it in fuel pressure on a carburetor, right? That they're really looking for 7 psi. Well, you're never going to get that with that kind of a resolution of a 0 to 2000 sensor. So these things are make sure that when you're going through the list, you don't just pick the first sensor that you see and order it and install it, but pick one that's within the range. That's just very important. So keep that in mind. If you have any questions on that, obviously contact your AIM dealer or contact me, and we'll walk through some of the different options that are available for you. So keep that in mind. Pretty important. The other thing that we need to do once you have determined it, you've installed it, you need to, of course, then tell the software what sensor it is. So you go into your configuration, you select one of the analog channels, either in the main list here or as an expansion. If you have a solo in a ACC or a channel expansion unit, you click on it. This dialog box opens up, and I like you to spend just a little bit of extra time here, again, thinking about whether it be pressures or temperatures, it doesn't matter, but you need to name it. You need to go through the channel function process by clicking on the little arrows and define what it is, because that will help define what it's going to ask you down a little bit later. And it also will be used inside of the analysis program to do certain things. So make sure you tell it the function of the sensor itself, and then go through the list. You can pick exactly by part number if you purchased an AIM sensor, or in your custom sensor list, it will be listed there. Select it. That does all that math for you automatically. Sample frequency. I wanted to spend about 30 seconds on this. Think about how fast, and this goes for any sensor, not just temperatures or pressures, but think about how quickly a pressure or a temperature changes, and there's no reason to take a sample frequency of 100 samples per second for a temperature sensor that doesn't change 200 times in a second, right? So think about how quickly whatever value it is that you're setting up the sensor for changes. And I tend to, for pressure sensors, maybe 20 samples per second will capture that information in enough granularity to give you the information that you're after. And then in temperature sensors, they do not change that quickly. Maybe your infrared tire temperature sensors, you bump those up. That's a little bit of a different thing. But your typical water temperature just does not change that quickly in an engine. So while memory is fairly vast nowadays in AIM loggers, so you don't really have to worry about that as much. I don't typically go down to 1 per second, but 10 samples per second is an area in temperature sensors that I'm pretty comfortable with, and 20 samples per second is an area in most pressures that I tend to do. So then, and then of course the display precision. How do you want to see it in your data? That's changeable in the Race Studio 3 software as well as the units. But set those two to what you kind of like, and then that will follow all the way through. But those two, once you're in Race Studio 3 analysis, you can change those and have those shown in any way that you like. But so set all that up and make sure you save it. And then the last one, I have done it, and I know a lot of other folks have done it as well. I save it into the configuration, and I forget to send that to the gauge. And so once you save it here, make sure you save the sensor into the configuration, save the configuration, and then transmit the configuration into the logger. Always an important step, right? So make sure you do all of that as well. Hopefully that gives you we've spent about half of the webinar talking about just some basics, right? Some of the stuff that you probably already knew, but hopefully it would just give you a little bit of a better idea on some small things to keep focused on, right? So reiterate the stuff that you maybe already knew. Let's talk though about some examples of where these, again, admittedly fairly basic sensors have been used, and some of the stuff that might be new ways of using this data, or at least ways of focusing on the data. So I've just found some slides. Most of them are sports cars, road race sports cars, but because that's a lot of data that I had, but the concepts are the same. And every one of these slides will have a little bit of a story behind it, and I'll tell that story and show you what I focused on with some of these sensors, and maybe you get some ideas of ways to use the data in the future. This happens to be a family, my son driving the car, a Mazda MX-5 Cup car in 2007 at Utah. That doesn't much matter, but give you an idea, it's qualifying. So there's just 2 laps of that he ran in qualifying. Did get the pole, so that's important to know. But I've got some temperature sensors and pressure sensor data here, and I just want you to see what we were doing and what was kind of interesting about it. I had a transmission temperature sensor, transmission oil, and I had a rear differential temperature sensor, and of course water temperature and oil pressure, right, in the car. There was other stuff obviously as well, but for this slide. And what was interesting about this is it was the last race of the year, real important one for us, and we had an oil sponsor, Redline Oil, that we had chatted with a little bit about trying to find a little bit more in the spec class performance, and so we chatted with them, and they provided us with some really thin weight oil, and so we stuck it in the car for qualifying, and it was interesting to watch that. Look at the transmission temperature; it did not really rise throughout the entire run. Yeah, it fairly low temperature, 112 degrees at the finish line, as he was coming in from his cool down lap. It did not rise. You can see the up and down as there was temperature changes from load. Kind of funny, if you start to zoom in on these, you can see exactly when it was rising, when it was on the throttle, and dropping off when he's off the throttle when there's no load. Kind of interesting to see when you zoom in at the macro level there. But the diff temperature was the one that really caught me by surprise. We had put in some very, very thin transmission and diff fluids to try to get performance, and it did work. The car gained lap time by quite a bit. But look at the temperature of the rear differential and what it did over the course of just a warm-up lap, a fairly easy warm-up lap, 2 hot laps, and then coming in. And it started at 75. 50 to 100, 75 or so degrees surface temperature, normal temperature. And as he's went out, this thing was climbing, and this is 50 to 250. You're going to see a trend here that fluid temperatures, I tend to follow scaling of 50 to 250. And so visually I can see it very better. And but look at how it climbed. And by the time we got to the finish, a rear differential with only 2 laps was already at 240.2 degrees at the finish line. A lot of temperature in the rear end. It was one of those things that I was thinking, maybe I'll run this fluid. They always talk about if you get too thin, there's performance there, but there's no shear strength there, and you can tear up some gears. So I ended up pulling both out, but for the race. But I really would not have run this a whole lot longer in the rear end. So the just an interesting thing to kind of see by putting in a normal, fairly straightforward sensor, and then using it to understand, hey, I've changed this fluid. What is happening? So think about the ways that you review that data. The next one I want to talk about is still rear differentials and some temperatures, but this is a couple of different cars, and I got permission to use this data. But the same basic car is the one that we raced back in 2007. Now that same car is being used in the new spec MX5 Cup class, and there was some testing, and people knew about the temperatures and the diffs, and they're running these things not just in sprint stuff but in endurance racing, and the diff temps were getting up to like 375 and some 350 375 Fahrenheit in some of the endurance races. And so they were thinking, well, what's a way that we can bring those temperatures down fairly inexpensively. So they designed Mazda and MiataCage.com designed this orange plate here. I just included a picture, and it's just a spacer plate, but it's aluminum, lots of fins on it, adds a substantial amount of volume of oil that's in the rear diff on these cars, and then of course all the cooling from it. Also has, for heavy duty endurance stuff, there is a you can take the oil out, pump it out, go through some coolers, and then bring it right back in up here where it sprays right onto the ring gear. But the data we're looking at here was just the plate was in there. This differential cooling plate was put in place, and then here's some data from it. Right, two cars. This happens to be Sonoma, Northern California, for a race they had, a SCCA Majors race, I think. So there's the speed data traces from two cars. You may notice that I used the global GPS global time to align the data. So that's why you see that it's not perfectly aligned. It's actually aligned at the exact time and where the car was. So, but two cars. One of them, the blue line here, was stock. The cover bolted right to the housing, and just standard, right? And here's the temperature throughout the entire run. And then the red line here had what they're calling version 1 of the plate. It was their very first prototype, and they bolted it on. And here is the two rear differential temperature traces throughout the entire run. I put a line here at the end that showed that at the end of the run, the 245 degrees that was in there, 245 Fahrenheit, and 212 degrees for the red one. A 33-degree difference, but right off from the word go, right? And yes, it's all just fluid and volume, additional volume, right? So the kind of an interesting thing. Ray has a question: what was the ambient temp? I did not include it here, but I did check it between this slide and the very next slide, which we'll continue on with, and I think it was like 78 degrees on this one. It was about 89 on the slide that we're about to look at. These same two cars with slightly different configuration of the plates. So certainly stuff that you can see. The interesting thing here in the middle was a full course yellow, 3 laps of full course yellow, and interesting to see how the temperatures. I would have thought the temperatures would have started to drop a little bit, but they just held their own, running around at 45, 50 miles per hour. So kind of interesting that especially the red one held its own. The blue one, while it was up there higher, it did have a little bit of a drop, but very relatively small amount of drop. And then when the green flag came back out, the rise began again, right? So the rise was a little faster, higher, slope was a little higher on the blue one with no plate than it was on the red one. So that was these two cars. Now the next slide is going to be the exact same two cars, and I used the same colors for each car. And remember that the red one here had version 1 and the blue one had no plate. The next slide, same track. The Now the red one has the exact same one that it had before. This is 3 or 4 months later. The cars came down for another event a little bit later in the day and a little bit hotter, and the temperatures are higher. But now the blue one that had was just stock with no plate now has what they called version number two or prototype number two, and it was better built, bigger fins. I don't remember all the technical details, but there was a newer version, and then it ran through the race went with no yellows the entire time. And at the end of this event, now the blue one, which was above the red one before, by if I zoom back up, it was 33 degrees warmer at the end of the first test. Now it is 25 degrees cooler than the red one, right? So there's like a 50-degree difference now between what was probably where the stock one would have been versus the version 2 is now 25 degrees cooler than version 1 in this exact same race. And you can see the heat build up as it went, and how it's starting to flatten out towards the end of the event. So just not here to discuss the plate or anything like that, but rather, boy, with a temperature sensor in an area that you maybe don't normally do it, and if it's something that you've seen high temperatures on, or you are just concerned, boy, there's a good place to put that temperature sensor and understand your car better. I will share that if I go back a couple slides where I was on our own spec MX5 Cup car, the only reason that we put a temperature sensor in the diff is because we went down underneath the car in the middle of a practice session and went to change the sway bar, and got close to the rear diff and was shocked at the temperature of the heat of it, right? Nobody ever thinks about rear diff temps. So with that, we decided to put a temperature sensor in it, and that's how we started to kind of study it a little bit more. So just interesting how you got a couple open analog channels in your data system, and you throw a sensor in and start to understand it better. So kind of kind of an interesting thing. So the next one I wanted to talk about of ways of using these basic sensors is this one is some data. I think this was VIR um, at the VIR track, and this is a V8, but this user had 3 different oil temperature sensors. Now I don't know exactly where they are and what was in between them, but when I saw the data, I thought this is perfect to share in this particular area. The what he had and what I've colorized here is red was a oil temperature from inside the ECU data stream, and then the car owner had also put in a couple of other temperature sensors on the engine oil that what he called oil temp outlet and intermediate oil. And I don't know exactly where they are amongst the coolers and fans and different things that are on the car, but it's just interesting to look at the temperatures of the engine in the ECU oil temp. That's typically an engine that's pretty close to the block, and the oil that's inside the engine at the time. And then you've got an oil temp outlet. In this case, it's like it's after a cooler or something, and then there's an intermediate oil which is probably coming out of a second cooler or getting ready to drop back into the engine. And you can see how effective your coolers and different things of where the oil is, and understand how things are working better. Do you need more air to that? Do you need a fan on it? Is it where is it cooling really effectively? I mean, the blue one is actually cooling more as the car started to move, and it was rising under the pace lap. And as soon as it started to get air, my guess is this one is driven a lot by air from the front of the car, because as soon as he got speed, look at the blue temperature held, even if not dropped a little bit. And you can see every time there's a higher speed area that it's climbing before the high speed, and then it flattens out as it gets up into the airflow. Little things like that just start to understand what the car is giving you for where you've put the sensors, and understand how the airflow and the pressures and the temperatures and all these different things are happening by adding a couple of fairly inexpensive sensors. So thought this was a really good example of some temperatures on the engine oil side of what is available to you. Let's talk pressures a little bit, and a little bit of temperature as well. And one of the biggest things I learned, again, ways that I've learned to use data have been from School of Hard Knocks sometimes, and one of them was water pressure. We were running a spec Miata at Thunder Hill in Northern California many years ago, 2005 or six, and the, my son's out there driving around, and that track is known for some rocks that sometimes get kicked up, and it pierced the radiator. And he's up there running in the front of the pack, and drafting and getting out in the lead, and moving around with five or six other cars, typical spec Miata stuff. And he was watching the gauge, was always pretty good about watching the gauge and the water temperature, and pretty soon he started feeling the car lose power, had to pull out of the way, come into the pits, and the brings it in, and the motor's just burnt up, and there's no water in it. And of course dad, and what did the temperature get to? What in the world we built all these alarms and we got all these numbers. He said that the water temperature, he's 16-year-old kid, right? But he said no, it peaked at two 214, I think he said. And as a matter of fact, the water temperature came down a little bit. And so I was happy, and everything was fine. And then it burned up. And turns out I had done a couple things wrong. Number one, we didn't have a pressure sensor, so I didn't know when all of a sudden there was no pressure, which means a hole in the system somewhere, which the rock through the radiator did. And number two, I put the temperature sensor right at almost the highest level of the motor, as the water comes is going back into the motor. And as soon as it started to lose water, the water temperature sensor was out of the water and just in the free air. And one of the biggest things I've helped a lot of people with is understand, boy, a fairly inexpensive water pressure sensor will be super valuable. So if you ever have a hose that breaks, or a pinhole in the radiator, or even a cap that goes bad, this pressure that's just bumping along at, this is probably a 13 psi cap on the radiator, is sitting there right at 13 or so once it gets warmed up and everything is going well. And if he were to get any leak in a radiator or a hose or anything, this would drop immediately down to zero, the pressure, even though the water is still in there for a while. And you can set an alarm on your dash, and if the pressure goes to zero, you really need to understand it and determine what you want to do. So water pressure, if you have a race car that has water and is water cooled, boy, a water pressure sensor is very, very cheap insurance. I've shared that with a lot of people. The other one that it was interesting on this particular car is that and something that a lot of people find valuable information is this one here happens to have a temperature sensor going into the radiator and out of the radiator. And this is something that I have found to be true, shocking to me, that the radiators don't always cool it off a ton across the radiator. In this particular case is another example of that. This is a V8 radiator, water coming into the radiator and out of the radiator, inlet, outlet, and 10 degrees. Most of us would think, at least I certainly do often think this way, that there will be a much larger delta difference in the temperature of the water coming into the radiator. Now that's the radiator's job, but the not always is it that way. And you should know that if you're depending on that. And maybe at this particular case, the driver had it kind of covered for aero reasons. And this is a pretty fast car, approaching 160 miles an hour at VIR. Maybe it only needed so much air to keep the water temperature down, and he's happy with that. But you should know that. And if the car was running up at 212, 220, you would want a bigger delta, and you want your radiator to be a little bit more effective at that point. So possibly qualifying tape, you might be right, Matt. So, but just understanding and knowing it, having a temperature sensor on both sides and a pressure, very, very valuable information for you as a in your design and your maintenance of your car, but let alone as a driver in the car at the time. So very, very cool information. The next one I want to talk about, we've talked a little bit about here. We've had entire webinars on it, but I thought it would, since we're talking temperatures and pressures, would be we should chat about this one. And it's tire temperatures. We have certainly AIM has some one-off sensors and a carding kit for tire temp sensors, but Trail Brake has a tire pressure and temperature kit that with a CAN connection can get all this information very easily. That's what this one happened to be on this particular car. And I just picked one tire and grabbed, and it's the left rear of a high horsepower car, again running Oak Tree Corner, running at VIR. And I picked this data for one big reason. The inside outside of the tire is fairly even. Looks like he's got his cambers about right. But look at the middle of the tire is right where I put the cursor here. It's 10 degrees warmer in the middle of the tire on from the outer to the middle, and from the inner to the middle is about 13 degrees. So there's the old general rule. It's not always perfect, but the old general rule is if you look at your inner and outer of a tire, when it's in load, they should be about even. When you're hit in the middle of a corner down the straightaways with camber, it typically is going to be a little hotter on the inside, but if you check it in the loaded part of a corner, it should be pretty even. It means your camber is probably pretty close. And the middle temperature sensor will typically help you gauge pressure. And if it's 10 degrees warmer in the middle across all the time, that typically will show that at least a good place to start thinking about it is maybe the pressure in that tire is a little bit high. There are reasons to have it this way. I'm not saying that's a hard and fast rule, but that is a great place to get close enough where you can start taking a half pound here or there and start to set your pressures where the car really likes it for lap time and speed. But this is a great place to look at this and go, I wonder what's going on here. Was this tire, where was this pressure? And was it too high or was it too low? Or do I have a tire that's built that way, or too narrow of a wheel? Or, this should open your eyes and go, what's going on here? In this particular case, the driver also had an additional temp sensor while driving was pointing straight down at the track. Another great way of understanding why your tire pressures and temperatures maybe were up or down on a particular session is what the track temperature, where it interacts, right? Where the rubber meets the road. To have this all the time is very, very valuable if you're going to look at tire temperature data and pressure data. This also had pressure data, but I didn't include it on this slide. It just got a little bit too busy. So kind of interesting. And I go back to, I see Matt had a link, added a link into the chat, which we'll have down in our, for those of you watching this on YouTube, where we did another one of these webinars on nothing but pressures and tire temperatures and pressures. And this is some of the data that I remembered. So I included this slide here where Matt was running along in his car, and he also has a track temperature sensor pointing down, as well as, of course, all the tire temperatures and pressures. But what was kind of interesting to see how well they work and how quickly they work is I stopped the video and the data, zoomed in on the data here, and you can see a shadow across the track here at Watkins Glen, and and as he's running up into this and going to cross this shadow, look at what the track temperature did. It jumps down and right back up. And we're talking, if we're right about there or so, it's about 97, 98 degrees or so leading into the shadow. And it was down about 80 degrees of surface temperature as he crosses that small little patch of shadowed track. So just kind of interesting that you can start to trust these things and wonder why there are these drops and this whole thing coming down and back up. Boy, you start to kind of trust what the data is showing you because of things like that. So just another way of using data and thinking it through and understanding it fully. It's kind of interesting. The next slide, as we bump along here, it's kind of interesting. I've added a couple. I've zoomed way in, and this one is a temperature sensor that you very well will probably have in your, if you have an ECU connection and some sort of the electronic piece of it will often have an intake air temperature, and it's one of those that you can use it in different ways. So I'm going to start looking at this data maybe from the top down, kind of acting like I didn't have the data below it, and then we add more channels. And we often look at the speed data, right? That's kind of your first thing is that we look at is look at the speed traces of a couple of laps or a single lap and look for some anomalies in it, and look at the the speed trace that I see here, there's all these, there's the car's accelerator. This happens to be Road America, and as the car is coming, this is the start finish line, so it's coming up the hill, the acceleration out of the last corner, then the acceleration kind of flattens off here a little bit. That's as it starts up the hill heading towards the start finish line. And then would be then all of a sudden I see these dips, and in the speed trace, there's one here, this one here, you can see it. I highlighted them yellow just to make them stand out a little bit. And then another one right here, and then this one I didn't highlight, but and then another one here, and another one here, and my mind immediately goes to, I wonder why the dips. Was he lifting? Was why were these happening? And so the next thing I added was the throttle position, see if he lifted off the throttle, and the RPM, and you can see that the car is flat to the floor. There's a shift right here, which shows for some of these back here coming off the corner. And then there's finally a shift here where the RPM drops and the throttle was off for the shift. And so you can see that one there. There's okay, we know the reason why that little deviation in the speed trace climbing. But what about the other ones? So then I added GPS longitudinal, because the next thing you start to wonder about is was there some bump drafting? These were Spec MX5 Cup cars, and they raced together. And boy, look at the longitudinal G's. Again, Road America coming out of the last corner. Those of you who haven't been there, you come around a corner, it goes flat for a little ways, and then it starts up a hill. And the acceleration, longitudinal acceleration, if you're above the line, you're accelerating. If you're below the line, you're in braking, right? You're slowing down. The forces are such that you can make that determination. So the car is accelerating fairly well, and then the acceleration starts to drop down right here. That's the beginning of the hill going up the hill, right? So it's not accelerating as well. And then all of a sudden we see this big two dips, sharp spikes. We're zoomed in quite a bit here. The two sharp spikes down, which would coming up, and what it was is he came up and then he bumped into a car in front of him. And now there's a big old chain of these cars, and then there's this huge spike up, accelerated. All of a sudden the driver was pushed into the seat. That would be his cohort behind him bumping him, right? And so that's where it started to lose some speed, where he bumped into the person in front of him, pushed him ahead, and then all of a sudden he got pushed from behind. Now all of a sudden you see the speed come right back up. And okay, then down the track a little while longer, you see a drop here in speed, but there he's bump drafting the guy in front of him again. And then the shift, this would be a kind of a normal loss of acceleration just for a millisecond or two, and then bumping along, and all of a sudden another dip down where he's bumped the guy in front of him again as he's pushing him down the front straightaway. And again, all of that is good, but I needed several channels and a little bit of information in my mind and to know what to look for. But one of the cool things about an intake temperature sensor that's picking up the air through the front of the car, obviously. So I brought up the intake temperature, and this is now something that I bring up to understand runs down the long straightaways in this class a lot, is the air temperature is bumping along here, 72, 73 degrees, 73.4, right where I put the cursor when he first started to catch the car in front of him. And then look at the temperature rise up, and eventually all the way up to almost 85, probably 84 degrees. So a 10-degree swing in temperature over a very short period of time, as he got pulled right in behind somebody and was bump drafting him up the straightaway. Intake air temperature, a fairly basic sensor, but it can be your draft sensor if you are in a class that does a lot of that, and you don't have the pitot tube that we talked about a couple of in the first of this series, where we were talking about GPS versus wheel speeds. We also threw in a pitot tube for airspeed. So we could see that there, and you can also see it in the temperature of the intake air that you probably have if you have an ECU based car, and maybe you aren't using it for that. So maybe start to bring that up and have one of those be a channel that you look at occasionally. Kind of an interesting thing to look at. The next one, we've got about 5 more minutes, and I think I'm just about right on my slides. The next one I wanted to chat about was brake pressure, a brake pressure sensor that we see a lot, and it's all good to be looking at the brake pressure build and then go along and then start to drop back down. And there's shapes there that we tried to do. Maybe this isn't a perfect one, and maybe there's even some coasting here. But what I really want to focus on this one was a little bit deeper into the brake pressure sensor and have you take a look at the shape of the sensor. And we see this quite a bit, and folks don't necessarily understand it at first. So I thought, well, let's show a good example of it. Here we get a brake pressure that is starting to build, and the speed is coming down. You can see the RPM, and then we see the blip of the throttle as the driver is rev matching, heel and towing, getting the downshifts done under braking. But the brake pressure trace shows that there is some work to be done. And every time that the driver goes to blip the throttle, he's also releasing brake pressure. And it's just something that I see a lot of folks don't review as they're, yeah, hey, I'm not great under braking, and the car is always, twitchy loose under braking, or all these different things. And when you go in and you start to look at the brake trace, well, the car is, the driver is putting transferring weight up to the front of the car by applying the brakes, and then every time he goes to blip the throttle, the chassis is pulling weight off the front of the car because he's releasing brakes, and as he's blipping the throttle. And it's something the driver doesn't know. When you're in the braking mode, it is a extremely busy time for a driver. Not only are you trying to get right to the maximum amount of braking, you're checking your mirrors because your car's all around you, trying to look for that little bit of a weakness to dive into the corner and outbrake you. And then you're also having to worry about the trail braking and lock up, and then getting your downshifts done and preparing, eyeballing the apex, and when do I turn in and when do I start to release. All of that stuff's happening, and they don't even know they're doing this. And if they're not reviewing the data, they don't see that there's room for a strong room for improvement here under the braking. So just wanted to make sure that you're not just looking at a maximum braking pressure, pretty good number here in this case, 1800 psi here, but how it is developing throughout the range of the brake. So everybody keep looking into maybe study this a little bit and look at your areas where you're braking and downshifting at the same time, that you don't have this little problem here. The last slide that I wanted to show here was another family race car that my dad has. He has a drag race. It's a Volkswagen pickup, actually, and I've showed some data from this in the past, but this one's interesting on the pressure side. Here is this red line here is where the longitudinal G's, where you see this big spike up. I know exactly when the car left the line because of the spike of the longitudinal G's. And then I start to study, why the inconsistency. This is what my dad was asking me and my brother who drives it. We're inconsistent on our 0 to 60 foot times, and trying to understand why the car leaves the start line really good sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. So we put in the data system, we're reviewing, and here's the throttle trace. This black one goes up to 100% as he's sitting there waiting for the light. And then and just to give you an idea of scale, that blue line right there is where I started the lap, and this is 2 seconds. So these grids are 2-second grids. So probably about a second and a half before the light turned green, he went to the floor. He's got the line lock things and all this fancy drag race stuff I don't understand fully, but what you notice here is the RPM is building as he's sitting there, and the boost, it's a turbocharged VR6 Volkswagen engine in it, and the boost was building up to about a 28 psi for the run. But when he actually released the car at the start line right here, the boost was only 4.6 psi. The car did not have time to build the boost on this particular run to get up to be at full power when it left the start finish line. So you ended up with this very weird drop in RPM, and then it kind of, in G's even a little bit, and the RPM is sitting there. It finally starts to build some RPM, and about here, when you see the G's come all the way back up, longitudinal G's, where the car is really really accelerating well is when the boost finally got up to where it's designed to be at that 28 psi or so. So the uh, what we've been working on, my brother and my dad, and with some additional data, is understanding, okay, well, your inconsistency is sometimes the boost did get there before the launch, other times it didn't, like this case. And this was still a sub 10-second quarter mile. It was like a 9.7 quarter mile or so. Still very quick, but it lost a ton of time here at the start when it didn't have the full power right off the start line. So the another way of using the pressure sensor, hey, the boost looks good all the way through. Your maximums are well that the driver could see, but here when things were really busy and really important on a drag race, the boost wasn't where it really needed to be, and we needed the data to understand that and then start to figure out ways to either get on the throttle earlier, figure out ways to get the boost up earlier and higher and faster so it's consistently at the boost pressure that he wants when he leaves the start line. Kind of an interesting way of looking at boost pressure. So just another way of understanding your data and understanding what it's all about. I see that we do not have any additional questions. I haven't been able to watch the chat very much. That's kind of the end of my example things. I hope what my hope here is temperatures and data from temperatures and pressure sensors is pretty basic. But what I was hoping for is that you see give you some ideas of different ways of looking at some pretty basic data sensors that might help you. These specific examples probably won't. You know, everybody's individual, and you have your own needs as you're developing in your car and your driver. But boy, the most powerful thing in data, and the way that I really got into learning about data and understanding it, is my desire for more information. And I walked through some simple steps, and we went out and we either got our tails kicked in speed, or the car broke. And so then I would always come back and go, what do I need to know in order to get more information to resolve that and understand why that happened, and then improve the driver or improve the car? What sensor can I add that would give me information that would help me do that? And that's why you see the water pressure sensor. I did not ever want to blow up another motor for a silly reason, right? Of a pinhole that ends up draining the water and we didn't know it. The rear diff temperatures, all of these different things. And maybe early on it was steering. We really wanted to understand exactly what the driver's inputs were in order to help him become better. All of these things, I just sat down and I thought, what do I need to know in order to make better decisions on prep and driver training? And that just opens up areas of what sensor do I add, or how do I include that sensor into analysis? So keep that in mind. Basic sensors, but using them in different ways and having an open mind of different ways of using this this data for improvement. So that's what I hope we were able to present here today for you. This one now goes into our Learn Fast e-training video list on YouTube. If you're here at the webinars live and you haven't visited there, make sure that you go there, youtube.com aim data, and all of our videos are go there right after we're done here. I work on getting that up on there. We also have a new playlist that Matt may have linked already. If he didn't, maybe he'll link it again, of some new videos that we're building, where we have a playlist for these tech tips that we're building now, and that list is now available for you. I think we're 6 or 7 of them so far. We're building about one a week or so, or going up there. Brick is doing a bunch in our Roanoke office. My goal now is to begin to build some of those. I've already got some built. I just haven't been happy enough to add to the tech tips playlist yet, but you're going to see some of those from me as well soon. Those are very short, specific videos, not an hour long, but very short ones on specific things. And one of the ones he did recently was custom sensors that we talked about today. He did it with with the focus area of a fuel level sensor. But you'll get a very strong understanding in a very, very focused short video way of custom sensors. He's got a bunch of them like that already, and so it's pretty good. There's the link that Matt put into the into the chat, and we'll have that linked in the description down below as well. So all of our videos go in there, tons of valuable information in there for you. So kind of ending the year here as far as track day stuff in many parts of the country. Of course, down in the South, they're still going strong. What we are here at AIM is a customer support company that happens to sell racing electronics, and our staff are out at events literally every weekend, and so look for us out there if you're need help away from the track and where we are not. You can give us a call, 800-718-9090 at any time. Email, you'll have my contact information. You probably already do, but if you don't, I'll show that here in just a moment, where we can chat and get other forms of support as well. So big on customer support here. So give us a holler. We want to really help you make sure you get the most valuable value out of your AIM hardware and software. Our next webinar, the one coming up on November 12th, coming up soon. We've had these 3 where we've talked about some good fundamentals. We're going to get back into a deep discussion of data analysis, and Matt Romanowski is going to join me from trailbreak.com. He's going to come in and join me, and we're going to talk about advanced use of segment-based data analysis. It's something I've been doing a lot more of, and there's some real power of being able to break up the track in the segments and then do segment analysis. And Matt and I are going to come together, and we're going to give some tips and tricks on how to get some really valuable data analysis done using segment-based. So we'll be talking about that in our next webinar, November 12th. It's going to be one of our later in the evening ones. It's going to be 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. And so come and join us November 12th. Looking forward to that. Contact information, if there's something you would like to chat about on something we've talked about today or any other time, there's my contact information, roger@aimsports.com. Look forward to chatting with you. Hope you enjoyed this one. I did. It's been it's been fun, and hopefully it gave you some information about pressures and temperature sensors and just some other ways of looking at data. So thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate you all contributing in the chat and the questions, and look forward to seeing everybody on the next one. So talk to you soon, and we will see you next time. See you later.